Republican state treasurer, but also really kind of running the Michigan Republican Party, and he was very corrupt. And so this is a thank you note he got from Wendell Willkie when he ran for president in 1940, because McKay controlled the Michigan delegation. Vandenberg was favorite son, but when it was clear Vandenberg wasn't going to get the Republican nomination, McKay shifted the Michigan votes to Willkie, which put him over the top for the nomination. And so this is just a nice, friendly letter thanking McKay for coming to see him. But I showed this to a guy who had written about Willkie, and he figured, yeah, it's probably an indication that Willkie had promised control of appointing federal judges in Michigan to Frank McKay in appreciation of McKay's help at the convention.
Wow.
Wow.
All right, Claire, do you want to start out?
Okay, just start out, kind of a technicality question.
Sure.
When we wrote our website, we referred to Russia and all the incidents with Russia as happening with Russia. And we got the feedback that we should probably be saying the Soviet Union. Since you are a far greater expert than we are, we figured we could ask you, what do you think, since I know all the books, the Vandenberg papers at least, always refers to problems with like Molotov, if I'm pronouncing his name, as problems with the Russian delegation. So I'm wondering what you think about that. And
well, it's a great question, because today it's Russia, and before the Russian Revolution it was Russia, but for 70 years it was the Soviet Union, and yet and Vandenberg used them interchangeably. People would say the Russians or the Soviets and really be talking about the same thing. So if I were you, I think I would talk about the Soviets and the Soviet Union, because that kind of places it in time. But one of Vandenberg's big speeches he called, "What is Russia up to now?"
Yeah.
At the height of the Cold War. So I think they're both right.
Okay.
And then just another question. During your research at the Bentley, how did you decide which sort, out of all the sources that are there, how did you decide which were the most valuable and what to look at?
Well, you start with Vandenberg's own papers, which actually only occupy 8 linear feet, and that's not very much. I mean, for somebody who was a senator for 23 years and a big cheese before that. And so start going through his papers, and then his wife Hazel's papers, and then partly when you're doing research, you're relying a lot on the archivists. Who do they know and who do they recommend? And they'll say, well, you should look at the Ralph Smith papers, because this guy kept scrapbooks about the Vandenbergs and newspaper clippings and things for the biography he was hoping to write. And so start with Arthur Vandenberg, and then with Hazel Vandenberg, and then the Ralph Smith papers, and one thing leads to another, so that you say, well, you want Michigan. The Bentley Library has all of the governors of Michigan's papers from the 20th century on, and so people Vandenberg was involved with politically, like the governor who appointed him, Fred Green. His papers are at the Bentley. So you look in the finding aid for Governor Green's papers for all of any correspondence related to Arthur Vandenberg. And then the Howard Lawrence papers. Lawrence was Governor Green's chief of staff. He later became Vandenberg's campaign manager. And so his papers are at the Bentley. And whenever I would run across a person, a politician or otherwise, whose papers I thought might touch on Vandenberg's, I would look at those papers. So Senator James Couzens, who overlapped with Vandenberg in the Senate, his papers are there, and look through the Couzens papers. And it's kind of like it's this telescope that keeps broadening the picture. And one of the researchers' challenges is always, where do you stop? Because this could go on indefinitely, and you're always worried about missing that one letter or one scrap of information that might open another world for you. Is this the kind of thing you're thinking about?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
one of the one of the great moments for me was in Hazel Vandenberg's scrapbooks at the Bentley, where she's pasting in clippings, and some of it's scrapbooks and some of it's diaries. She might be pasting in clippings or writing down her in her diary a dinner party they went to, or it might be a tea or a luncheon, a social event in Washington. And in the margin in one of those, and I can't remember now if it's a scrapbook or a diary, she writes about who was there and different. Let's say it's a society tea with a number of women in Washington, and then she'll write one of whom is the American wife of the Argentine ambassador to the U.S. And she'll write in there, I don't know if I mentioned this at the talk at the library or not, but she'll mention, she wrote a note in the margins, Courtney is writing down everything. So Courtney is Courtney Letts Despill. Her maiden name was Letts, Letts. She was from Chicago. And so then I think by that point I could finally Google, but you find in my research, you Google Courtney Letts Despill, and turns out her papers are at the Library of Congress in Washington. So next time I'm in Washington, I go to the Library of Congress and look up her papers, and she has, let's see if I've got some of them here, like 2,000 pages of handwritten journals of her own. And in that she talks about, she gave me the material that I used for the preface of the book, where Vandenberg comes stumbling out of the embassy party. That was from her description of that day, buried somewhere on page 1300 of her handwritten papers. So you go to her handwritten journals and look at the period when she and her husband were in Washington in the 1930s, and just start reading that and come across that reference, and come across a reference to Franklin Roosevelt here, or a reference to Vandenberg's mistress there. And those are just those wonderful little moments of discovery that nobody could have predicted. And but that grew out of just a little note that I saw in Hazel Vandenberg papers at the Bentley Library.
Yeah.
So then, what do you think was maybe like the most interesting or valuable source of all of this ridiculous amount of sources?
Well, the Arthur and Hazel Vandenberg scrapbooks were probably the most sort of personally intimate and valuable for that reason. There's so many different sources. It's just really hard to say that there was one. I mean, you had different forms of aha moments, but I would say the Arthur and Hazel Vandenberg scrapbooks were the most interesting, in that they were a window on everything that was happening in their lives. And so you could look through that window and find the ambassador's wife's papers, or look through that window and say, well, you know, I need to read this or that book about this, what was going on at that time. But they were the window that I was looking through more than any other. And then not all these books, probably 2/3 of these books and all of these files are what I inherited from the guy who started out writing doing Vandenberg research and then died back in 1990. And so that was what so 1/3 of the books are probably my own additions to that, but 2/3 of the books and all the files came from him, and again gave me a real good jump on my research. So there's a very famous quote that's often ascribed to Vandenberg, where when President Truman presents the idea of the Truman Doctrine, where it says the United States is going to come to the help of any free nation threatened by outside forces. In other words, by communism at that point. And this is like, whoa, if this is going to be our foreign policy, that's a little scary, because that could oblige us to do lots of stuff all over the world that where we may not want to intervene. So Truman is laying that out with congressional leaders at the White House, and one of them is Vandenberg. And Vandenberg is alleged to have said, well, Mr. President, if you have to, what Vandenberg probably said was, you've got to make this case to the American people if you want me and Congress to support you. In other words, we're not going to just give you a blank check to go intervene anywhere in the world without the public buying into the importance of this. One historian with no footnote claimed that Vandenberg told the president, Mr. President, I'll support you, but you've got to scare the hell out of the country. Now, that may have caught the temper of the times. In other words, you got to get people's attention that this communist threat is real, and we need to be ready to respond. And that implies scaring people. There's no, but that quote has often been ascribed to Vandenberg, but there is no evidence that he ever actually said it. And so this professor somewhere in these files has a whole file on trying to track down if anybody really had proof that Vandenberg told Truman to scare the hell out of the country. Couldn't find any. And so, I didn't have to wonder about that in the way that you would have to if you were starting out cold. But anyway, I'm rambling all over here. I don't know what suits your purpose.
That's okay.
So much information.
So, okay, now we have real questions. So, how did Vandenberg become a leader of the isolationist movement?
He was, like so many Americans, he was very disillusioned after World War I, that we had sent hundreds of thousands of soldiers and spent millions and millions of dollars intervening in the war in Europe, fighting the Germans alongside the French and the British. And when it was all done, and Woodrow Wilson had said, President Wilson, in getting us to do that, sort of like scaring the hell out of the country, he said, this is a crusade to make the world safe for democracy. And so on that basis, Vandenberg and most Americans joined in that crusade. It sounded like the right thing to do. In the wake of that, the peace treaty was written so that it was very one-sided in favor of the French and the British, and sowed seeds of discontent among the Germans, who felt there was never a formal surrender to end World War I. It was just a truce, and the Germans felt like they got the short end of the stick, and they were very bitter about that. And Adolf Hitler could play on that bitterness in coming to power. And so, but if you were Vandenberg and a lot of other Americans, you said, where did we go wrong? We thought we were going to make the world safe for democracy, and now we got all these dictators threatening war everywhere in the 1930s, Hitler and Mussolini and the Japanese. What went wrong? And how did we get into this in the first place? So Vandenberg was part of a committee that became the Nye Committee. Gerald Nye was the chairman of it, NYE, in the middle 1930s, to investigate the causes of of American involvement in World War I. Was there a real story here? Was it a conspiracy of bankers because we had loaned so much money to the French and the Europeans that we wanted to protect those loans by propping up those governments? Was it a way for the armaments makers and the people who made weapons to make a lot of money, and so it was in their interest to have the war? What happened? And so the Nye Committee is doing this investigation, and also, and out of that grows this conviction that we don't want to get fooled again. We were sort of fooled and tricked into coming into World War One. Who knows why? And it didn't have a good result. So we don't want that to happen again. So let's be neutral as Americans. So that committee ends up introducing neutrality legislation that the Congress enacts, and so that in 1937 there's a very strict neutrality law that says, if war breaks out somewhere in the world, the United States is not going to sell arms, have trade of any kind with those belligerent countries. We're going to be totally neutral. Because the moment you say, well, we'll sell you stuff, but we won't sell your stuff, you're picking sides. So we're going to be totally neutral. And for Vandenberg, that's an outgrowth of disillusionment with World War I and his experience on the Nye Committee. It also aligns with what Alexander Hamilton had George Washington say to the American people in his farewell address, that we should avoid entangling alliances. And so neutrality becomes Vandenberg's sort of civic religion, his mantra. We're going to stay neutral, whatever happens over there in Europe. We're not going to get into their mess again. And so Vandenberg, from the Nye Committee, emerges as a real spokesman for the Republican, and then this is happening at the same time that the Republican Party is decimated in the 1930s in the elections. So they're down in 1930, after 34, I think, to only 17 Republicans in the Senate for a couple of years. And so there's this tiny minority. You rise very quickly in your seniority, and Vandenberg in 1934 was the only Republican senator from a major industrial state who was reelected. So his prominence rises at the same time that he is coming out of the Nye Committee as a spokesman for isolationism. And then the leading isolationist in the Senate is a guy named William Borah, Senator Borah from Idaho, and he's older, and he dies early in 1940, I believe. And Vandenberg was sort of his protege. He was Vandenberg's mentor. So when he dies, Vandenberg is kind of the undisputed spokesperson for Senate Republicans, and he's an ardent isolationist, a spokesperson on foreign affairs and leading isolationist. So then when it comes time in 1939, when Borah is not in the best of health, to fight Roosevelt on the repeal of the arms embargo in the Neutrality Act, Vandenberg is leading the fight. And so that kind of marks his identification as the leader of the isolationists.
But then, how would you say he shifted from that isolationism and internationalism? Would you say that would be a sudden shift or more of a gradual change in his life?
Definitely gradual. There's a lot of baby steps. And so, Pearl Harbor temporarily shifted it for everybody, because you couldn't say, well, we're going to stay out of the war after you'd been attacked. And so so some isolationists would say, well, isolationism ended right there. But but it really just kind of stopped the debate, because now we all had to fight a war. But for Vandenberg, I think it started with Pearl Harbor, because that was a real wake-up call that, hey, we could be attacked. The Japanese, in this case, only halfway across the ocean, but they could come halfway across an ocean and attack American soil. So that was a first step. And then another step was Vandenberg's nephew, Hoyt Vandenberg, was a very young hotshot, became a general in the Army Air Force, and the Air Force was kind of the new frontier in how wars were fought. It wasn't even its own department then, it was part of the Army, but he could see the effects of long-range bombing and things like this, that America could no longer be assured of being safe behind the oceans, which the isolationists had always clung to. And so that's happening along the way. And then, and again, I'm being repetitive of some of this stuff from the library talk, but and then in 1943, right in the middle of the war, the Republicans have to figure out how they're going to campaign in 1944, because in 1940, the isolationists are left behind with the outbreak of war in Europe, public opinion shifts, and Wendell Willkie, who's not an isolationist, gets the Republican nomination. So now, 3 years later, they're looking ahead to 1944 and thinking, some of us are isolationists, and some of us are all in with Roosevelt as interventionists. What's going to be our platform? What are we going to run on? What can we agree on so that we can mount a campaign as a unified party and have some shot of recovering seats in the Senate, maybe of challenging Roosevelt for the presidency? And so that's when the Republicans convene this meeting on Mackinac Island to figure out what their foreign policy is going to be in 1944. And so and they put Vandenberg, as the leading Republican spokesman on foreign policy, is in charge of finding a compromise. And so that's when he takes all these leading Republican elected officials and gets them to agree on an expression of support for something like what becomes the United Nations. And these are some of the same people who had fought the League of Nations after World War I. So he gets that agreement on support for a post-war world organization, and that pulls him further from isolation to talking more about international solutions. And not only does the compromise pull him in that direction, but there's also a lot of the press the media is enthusiastic about it. So he becomes, in the eyes of kind of what today we would call the media elite, the Washington press corps, he's viewed kind of like with a new degree of respect, and his ego really likes that. So it kind of feels good to be moving away from isolation to be the middle ground. And then, and so that pulls him further. And then in 1943, and I'll get my dates quite right here, but because the tide of the war is turning and the Allies are beginning to liberate countries and territories that have been occupied by the Germans and the Italians and the Japanese, they got to figure out, what do we do with these newly liberated territories that that are ravaged by war and people are starving? We've got to come in with some relief. And it's not going to be just the United States, it's going to be the Allies who are fighting the war are also trying to get together to figure out how to provide relief and govern these liberated territories. And so Roosevelt calls a conference, it's called for the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. He calls this conference at the Greenbrier Hotel in West Virginia with all these representatives from all of our allies in the war to figure out what to do with help these liberated territories. And a lot of Vandenberg and a lot of particularly the isolationists are saying, wait a minute, we're negotiating with these other countries. This is like, you're talking about a treaty here, and that requires a 2/3 vote of the Senate. You can't just Roosevelt just can't decide to call everybody together and say, what's the world going to look like as we liberate these countries? So, so they have a lot of Senate debate over this, and Vandenberg finds another compromise. He said, okay, he tells Roosevelt, he basically negotiates with the State Department and the administration and said, okay, we won't treat this as a treaty because this is just a short-term temporary fix for countries that need help. But it's also something that you've got to come to Congress for and get our approval. You can't just decide this on your own. So all you need is a majority, not a 2/3 vote, to set up this rehabilitation administration. And in those negotiations, again, a compromise that pulls Vandenberg closer to working with other countries on post-war solutions. And then comes toward the end of the war, Vandenberg's very suspicion of Roosevelt when Roosevelt's about to go to Yalta for the summit conference with Stalin and Churchill to decide to make some decisions about the United Nations and set a meeting for that and that sort of thing. Vandenberg gives his big speech in the Senate calling for a post-war treaty to keep Germany and Japan from ever being a military threats again. Basically, we're going to demilitarize them. We're not going to let them have armies, and we're going to promise each other that we're not going to let them attack us. He makes that proposal, and Roosevelt goes to Yalta and realizes as he's putting together the American delegation to the UN that he can't ignore Vandenberg and expect to get Republicans to buy in to approving the United Nations Charter. He's got to appoint Vandenberg to the UN, founding the American delegation to start to create the UN. And he does, and I talk about how I think Vandenberg was, for a lot of reasons, the most influential American delegate. So by that time, Vandenberg is pulled deeply. He's gone from the Nye Committee, where he's trying to figure out how did we ever get into this mess over in Europe and how can we stay out of it. And the only way to stay out of a future war is to be totally neutral, to arriving in San Francisco, finding himself almost the spokesman for the American interests in how do we create a world organization that's going to reflect our interests. It's going to allow us to have a mutual defense treaty with our Latin American neighbors that can't be interfered with by the UN, and how can I protect American interests in these in this UN discussions, and in the process make the UN a good place to be able to work for world peace. And so he's I think that's kind of the arc that pulled from one direction to the other.
What do you believe was Vandenberg's motivation during his work for the United States?
For a lot of politicians, including Vandenberg, there's always ego. It's like, I want to do big stuff and make a big name for myself. And he absolutely was one of those people. But as time went on, I think he recognized more and more that his generation was in a unique position to set the stage for the next several generations of whether we would have peace or not, and what that would mean for the United States. And that sense of being involved in something so significant, I think what was the Abraham Lincoln's great quote about appealing to the better angels of our nature. It made that sense of being part of creating a new world order after the war imbued him with a great sense of responsibility. And he was a very civic-minded character. And so, while it gratified his ego to be in the middle of things, he also recognized that he could have a unique responsibility to be one of the key people figuring out what would give the United States the best shot at maintaining a free world on our terms.
How do you think that Vandenberg's childhood and his other works before the Senate contributed to his actions as a senator later on?
Childhood, of course, it's a little tricky to say. I don't want to play armchair psychologist. You could say that because his father nearly went bankrupt and he had to go to work when he was 9 years old, that the household went from being secure to being very insecure. And so you're looking for security in your life again. How do we rebuild a stable household? Now, it's a big leap, but let's try to make it to say, after the war, the world is in a shambles. And how do we try to rebuild a stable world? Is there something there? I don't know. But that would be, in terms of childhood, and he was also a very hard worker from a very early age. So I would say those were pieces of his childhood. he'd always been interested in international affairs. This guy, when he was 16 years old in 1900, he was has to be a senior in high school because he graduated when he was 16. He won a speech contest talking about, there was one of the very first international peace conferences was held in, I think, 1899 in The Hague in the Netherlands. And he gave a speech about that. So here he is as a 16-year-old talking about international relations and talking about some of the ingredients that would go into the United Nations 50 years later. So that childhood, and I think his early career in the newspaper business, newspapers were so much more important then than they are now. I mean, now we've got so much different media, and well, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post still have a lot of influence. People turn to so many other sources of social media and broadcasting and everything else for their news and their opinions. It wasn't that way 100 years ago. It was newspapers were the dominant source of information for everybody. And so if you ran the editorial page of a newspaper, you could influence a lot of opinion. And so because he became an editor when he was just before he turned 22, and because he was a good self-promoter as well, he was very active in Republican politics, and he'd write an editorial about the League of Nations or about this or that issue and fire it off to politicians and senators. And sometimes he was trying to butter them up. He'd write an editorial praising something that one of them did, but they would read it and pay attention because what he said influenced thousands of readers. And so, and during the debate over the League of Nations right after World War II, he's writing editorials trying to find a compromise, trying to find, the Republicans want some reservations. They don't want to just accept the League of Nations covenant, the charter, without making a few tweaks to it. And Woodrow Wilson says, no, I helped write this thing. We're not going to change a word of it. You Congress accept it. And Congress says, forget it, buddy. We're not going to just take it because you tell us to. We want to tweak it a little bit. And so Vandenberg is trying to help for ways to tweak it and save it, and sending letters to Henry Cabot Lodge at the Foreign Relations Committee, sending editorials to him, and being listened to, having Lodge say that I'm going to borrow some of your phrases, and Lodge is Wilson's chief antagonist, having William Howard Taft, who was also a Republican but campaigning for the League of Nations, come to Grand Rapids, and Vandenberg is writing front page editorials to get his attention, and he gets Taft to change his claims that he got Taft to change his mind from saying, no, we can't change a word on the charter, to say, well, yeah, we need to approve it, we need to be part of the League of Nations, but we need to tweak it a little bit, you're right. And this is in 1919 and 1920, Warren Harding runs for president against Wilson's successor, and one of the big issues in the campaign, the big foreign policy issue, is should the United States join the League of Nations or not? And Vandenberg writes the speech for Harding that says, well, only if we get some reservations. And so 25 years before the UN meeting, he's already influencing the debate on world affairs. So it's like, I think he gets to Congress, gets to the Senate, and figures, well, of course I'm going to be in the middle of the post-war debate because I'm used to doing that. So I think that's how his career helped shape it.
And how did his childhood heroes like Theodore Roosevelt and Alexander Hamilton influence his work?
I think Theodore Roosevelt was inspiring because Roosevelt believed in public service and was very public spirited and gave you a sense of idealism. I mean, this guy was a ball of fire, a bundle of energy, and enormous ego also, but really trying to do what he thought was in the best interests of the country, with major ambitious ideas for reform and a very just an exciting, charismatic figure who would infuse someone your age with just a sense of idealism. If I see him in government, it must be a noble thing to do to be in government. Something we may not have quite as much of today. And so I think that's where Teddy Roosevelt came in. And then Alexander Hamilton, again, he was orphaned when he was young, worked as a clerk in the Caribbean on a little island near where he was born, arrived in the U.S. with adults who were going to help him get an education, but otherwise penniless, and a completely self-made man, self-made person, and in a way that again was inspirational to a young guy from a little city in the Midwest whose parents had run out of money when he was a kid. He could see that self-made character. I mean, if we think about people like Washington and Jefferson, I mean, they were wealthy plantation-owning families. I mean, it was a whole different ballgame. Hamilton was this young striver from kind of coming from nowhere, who showed you could really get ahead and be a leading voice in government, and was also a brilliant writer and thinker. And so he was just a great hero for Vandenberg to worship. And oh, by the way, even though his no entangling alliances, as I understand it, and it's not my specialty, was to keep us from hooking up with France in some of the European wars. He might have been happy to align with England. He was kind of an Anglophile, but his no entangling alliances idea was what stuck with Vandenberg. So they're both, Hamilton and Roosevelt are both these charismatic and idealistic figures. They're they're heroic with their energy and all they achieve, and they're inspirational because they call on, they set a really high standard for public service.
How do you think Vandenberg compromised with the Soviet Union while he worked with them? And do you think there was more conflict or compromise when they clashed during conferences or things like that?
I think he seemed to find the right tone of willingness to compromise, but very clear-eyed and realistic about how tough they were, and that compromising too easily wasn't going to get you anywhere. And again, for someone like Vandenberg, also his generation was very much influenced by what happened before World War II, when they would have viewed the British trying to compromise with Hitler at Munich, that appeasement, saying that didn't work. And so we are not going to appease the Russians just because they make this or that demand. I mean, we've got to be realistic. We're not going to send our soldiers over to liberate Poland, but we're not going to just automatically roll over and say, those free elections you talked about, don't worry about them. We're going to keep hounding them and pressuring them. And that was the emerging ideology in the United States that Vandenberg really spoke for. And so when so he was willing to talk with the Russians, but he wasn't going to cave too quickly, and that was kind of the right balance, I think.
What was Vandenberg's most significant action to ensure bipartisan foreign policy?
It wasn't so much a single action as a continuing practice. And so that same effort within the Republican Party to get compromises, like at Mackinac, he applied within the Senate to get compromises between Republicans and Democrats. And so, so in the case of the Marshall Plan, to get bipartisan cooperation, I would say he did two notable things. One, he commissioned the Brookings Institution, the big Washington think tank, and it was like one of their first really big jobs, to do a study of of how the Marshall Plan should be structured and run. Should it be run out of the State Department? Should it be should it be independent of the rest of the government? How should it be structured? And because he knew he needed to put that together to sell it to the Congress and not make it look just like a Truman project. And so he did a lot of, had a lot of research done, and did a lot of research about how the Marshall Plan should be run. And then when it came time for hearings in Congress, he did exhaustive hearings. I mean, one of the slams on like tax reform or a lot of major recent legislation is that it didn't get debated a lot. It just, the party in control rams it through Congress. Vandenberg held hearings, basically said, we'll listen to everybody's point of view. And so if some Democratic congressman had some obscure economist who had a point of view about the Marshall Plan, Vandenberg would let him testify before the Foreign Relations Committee. And so you kind of wear down the opposition by listening to them and incorporating some of their thoughts where you can. And so it was that combination of prep work and a willingness to listen that helped with the Marshall Plan. And a lot of compromising. I mean, Dean Acheson at the State Department would complain, we send over the Marshall Plan, the administration requesting X billions of dollars, and over 5 years of it, we said, no, that ain't gonna fly. We're gonna take, a fraction of that, and we're gonna give it to you 1 year at a time. And with that, Vandenberg could sell it to opponents in the Senate, while at the same time keeping the program moving. So that's the Marshall Plan. And then along comes NATO, and he is going to type out the NATO resolution himself and write it, and then he's going to be able to say, well, back when we did the UN, we have this regional agreement with Latin America for mutual defense, and this is just like that. We're just going to do it with us and Europe. And again, I don't know. He would have hearings on NATO and would invite in senators who might have been isolationists or opponents who weren't on the Foreign Relations Committee, but who he knew would be potential opponents, and let them come in and ask questions of the generals and the diplomats of what they've got in store, so that you give them access. Maybe you win them over, or at least you neutralize them at a very early stage in the process, instead of having your opponents sitting out there and wait for you when you bring the legislation to the floor of the Senate and then shoot it down. Let's see if we can get these guys in, understand what their opposition is, win some of them over, change some language, but make sure that when we bring it to the floor, we've done everything we can to incorporate their thoughts. Anyway, I think those would be examples.
Oh yeah, and near the end of his life, there's a lot more conflict around bipartisan foreign policy. Do you think that his absence from the Senate might have contributed to that?
Absolutely. There are two things going on. One is that he had to be careful, because particularly after the Republicans, who thought they were going to win everything in 1948, they thought they were going to beat Truman, and hold on to their majorities in Congress. And instead, Truman upsets Dewey, and the Republicans lose their majorities in Congress. Well, that leaves a lot of Republicans really angry. And so they're going to, what do we blame? Well, maybe we got to blame Vandenberg because maybe he was too cozy with Truman. Maybe we should have been more critical. I mean, just like Truman didn't campaign against Vandenberg in 1946 when he was running for re-election, Vandenberg had a hard time criticizing Truman's foreign policy because he'd done so much to help create it. And so, some of the Republicans were resentful of Vandenberg's, he almost succeeded too well at bipartisanship and blurred their identity. And so there's that going on, and then he goes off the scene, and there is no other Republican with his kind of stature who can either challenge or agree with the administration. So you got simmering resentment, and you've got nobody who's kind of a unifying force in the Senate anymore that for people to rally around, for Republicans to rally around. And then you've got things that were never part of all the great bipartisan work, which was oriented mostly toward, the UN, but then mostly toward Europe with NATO and the Marshall Plan. And now you've got civil war in China. And that was never really a part of bipartisan cooperation, but you've got Republicans who blame the administration for losing China, as if somehow we could have kept the communists from taking over. And so that creates bitterness between the parties. And then war breaks out in Korea. And geez, what's going on here? We've got Truman goes to war. He hasn't asked us for a declaration of war. And so, again, and Republicans say, and we can campaign against that in our next election. And so those things are all, and then you've got Senator McCarthy coming along, and he's just attacking not only Democrats, but even, George Marshall was part of the Democratic administration, but was non-political. McCarthy is a Republican attacking all these Democrats and accusing them of being soft on communism. And a lot of the Republicans, bad analogy with Trump, but a lot of the Republicans in Congress don't necessarily want to speak out against McCarthy because he's driving the Democrats crazy, and they kind of like that, even though they think, oh God, he's really overdoing it, and the guy's full of it half the time. But we're seeing polarization happen because of China, because of the war in Korea, because of McCarthy. And Vandenberg's not there to affect that. And he wouldn't have affected China much, but he might have said to McCarthy, don't try to tell me Marshall's soft on communism. I've been working with this guy. He helped us win the war. I've negotiated with the Soviets. He's not soft on communism. Vandenberg might have been one of the few first people who could have stood up to him and stopped that. And Vandenberg would have been someone Truman would have consulted or had to consult on Korea. And he could have gone back to the Republican caucus and said, yeah, it's a miserable thing, but we got to be doing what we're doing. And, the president's doing as best he can or whatever. So the absence of Vandenberg, I think, definitely made that worse.
How did Vandenberg become a leader internationally?
Well, it was really starting with the UN. He was so involved. He was involved in diplomacy in a way that I don't think any senator has been before or since. I'd say Tom Connolly, his Democratic counterpart, was with him too, but Vandenberg. But the administration didn't really need Connolly because they were Democrats. They could get the Democratic vote. They needed Vandenberg because he led the Republicans, and Vandenberg was smarter and more forceful than Connolly too. And so the UN broadens him out in a way. Suddenly he is acting in a way, negotiating with the Russians and other countries. And then Truman's decision to ask him and Connolly to go to Paris for the post-war peace conferences after World War II means that he's involved in diplomatic negotiations for the next several months. I mean, he gets back to Grand Rapids the day before the election when he's running for re-election in 1946. And so he's by that time he has spent hundreds of days negotiating on behalf of the United States. I mean, really playing a kind of a State Department role. And then when he's chairing the Foreign Relations Committee, he's really recognized as the person all this important legislation has to go through. So I think that would be the case.
What would you say is the influence of the Vandenberg Resolution on later events?
It enabled the United States to join NATO, to commit our support to the protection of the Western democracies, which sent a clear message to the Soviet Union that just because you outnumber the smaller European countries on the continent, you can't just you can't just throw your weight around. You can't just decide, we want all of Berlin. We're going to stand up to you. And so it really it was a big part of the. I don't know if you've talked at all about the containment theory after World War II of the solution that Vandenberg was a part of, that George Kennan in the State Department really first defined, was we're not going to appease the Russians. We're not going to try not to go to war with them. We're just going to be very forceful about saying, guys, don't push us. And the Vandenberg Resolution and NATO really was instrumental in the United States being able to adapt that response, which led to the Cold War stalemate for decades, and ultimately led to the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Can you explain the connection between Article 51 of the UN Charter and NATO?
Yes, Article 51 grew out of that, as I understand it, was the article that Vandenberg was concerned about. There was a debate when the UN was when the Charter was being drafted, about whether you could have regional security agreements, which Vandenberg was all for, because we don't want, first of all, because we are Latin American, we don't want, since the Monroe Doctrine in 1820 or whatever, the United States' position was, we don't want foreign powers interfering in the Western Hemisphere. That's our backyard. You guys, French and British at the time, stay out of it. Now, Russians, stay out of it. And if you were a Latin American country looking to the United States for protection against potential communist influence, then you wanted a treaty where, if we get communist pressure in Chile or whatever, we want to be able to call on the United States for help, not be against, if at the time, and sometimes the threat was certainly exaggerated, but if the aim of the Soviets, in theory, was to foment international revolution. I mean, that was the ideology that they operated on. And so if you're a little country in Central or South America and you're kind of worried that, I've got communist revolutionaries in my country, and, for all we know, the Soviets are going to supply them with aid and they're a threat to our country, we want to be able to call on the United States for help. And so it was a mutual thing. And so but a lot of the people, including in the U.S. State Department, when the UN was created, said, we don't want these. We want to get away from spheres of influence and power blocks. If the United Nations is really going to work, we can't have the world split up into all these little subgroups, because the Russians are going to have theirs in Europe and we're going to have ours in America. And so Vandenberg had some resistance within the State Department to the idea of this mutual security in the Western Hemisphere. So he pushed that through, and that became a template or a pattern then for NATO to say, we're not doing this as an aggressive act. We're getting together for our mutual security in Europe, just like we did in the Western Hemisphere. And so without Article 51, the UN might have had a charter that said you can't do that. But Article 51 said you can do that. So that's where that comes in.
What was Vandenberg's role in the Pan American conferences and the creation of the Rio Pact?
He was if I'm not mistaken, there had been a meeting at, was it the Act of Chapultepec or something in Mexico City, I think early on in World War II, and then everything got kind of put on hold in the war, but there was still this desire for a regional security treaty, and so then right after, before the war even ends, comes the UN Charter, and so the Rio Pact then was kind of getting back to this project we've been working on when the war started for a mutual security treaty. It's now allowed under Article 51, so let's create it. And so the Rio Treaty was designed to do that, and that was just like with the European peace treaties. Vandenberg and Connolly went along as members of the U.S. delegation with Secretary of State George Marshall. Now they'd gone to Europe with James Burns, who preceded Marshall. Now they go to Brazil with Marshall as Secretary of State, and so that was where they kind of fleshed out. That was between the creation of the UN and the creation of NATO. So it kind of fleshed out what the regional security treaty would look like in the Western Hemisphere, and I like to think in the story that it was as important as anything for the fact that Marshall and Vandenberg, and in this case their wives, spent a few days together close socially, and it allowed Vandenberg and Marshall to bond more, which was also on the eve of the Marshall Plan hearings and Marshall Plan legislation in the Senate, so that a side effect of the Rio Treaty Conference was to get Marshall and Vandenberg closer together, and that paid big dividends when it came time to create the Marshall Plan. If I'm not mistaken, Marshall outlines the Marshall Plan at Harvard in June of 47, the need for helping with European reconstruction, and then in August of 47 is the Rio Conference and the Rio Treaty, and then later on in 47 and into 48 comes all of the debate over how big the Marshall Plan should be and what it should look like, and how are we going to get it through the Congress.
How did his involvement in the conferences and the Rio Pact reflect his other achievements in protecting American interests abroad and regional security?
I think these educated him. It made him more comfortable he and his wife always loved to travel, so they traveled abroad more often than the average American or the average senator. But it makes a big difference when you feel like you are directly involved in negotiations. It's a lot easier to be arguing for the results than it is if you're sitting back in Washington and the diplomats come and report to you that we did this and so, and we want you to put this through Congress. It became much more personal for him. He had a lot of hard work and emotion invested in trying in these international agreements.
How would you say Vandenberg reformed and united the Republican Party?
I don't think he did. I mean, he at the height of his power, he was able to unify a party that had been historically in two different camps on a lot of foreign policy. And so he kind of patched things together for a while, but if we go back to 1940 with Wendell Willkie, Vandenberg and Taft are on one side and Willkie's on the other over whether the United States should intervene in Europe and or how isolationist we should be. And in 1950, we're back to some of that same debate again, as Vandenberg is fading from the scene. And so I don't think he really reformed it. I think he held together a coalition during a very crucial time, because 1940 to 1950 was both the war and then all the big post-war stuff of the Marshall Plan and NATO and the UN and the Truman Doctrine. That all happened in that decade, and his being able to hold the party together was a crucial part of that. But we're kind of now back to where we were in 1940. I mean, and Rand Paul making very articulate arguments as an isolationist. I mean, he's reluctant to vote for the new Secretary of State nominee because Mike Pompeo, when he was in Congress, was very interventionist. And so you've got those same forces at work again. And there isn't a Vandenberg figure who could kind of make them sit down together and say, guys, we got to figure out how we can agree on this, or Democrats are going to eat our lunch next time around, or the world's going to go to hell in a handbasket, or whatever it might be. But because those tensions are back at it again.
How does Vandenberg's legacy carry on today?
He becomes a symbol of bipartisanship, and so what it means is when and we see it more if the White House, if the executive branch belongs to one party and the Congress is in the hands is controlled by another party, then the call goes up, where is Vandenberg? Where is there a Vandenberg of today? There's no other name that gets employed like that. And it happened, I remember it happened when Clinton was president and the Republicans had control of Congress, and I think Clinton it might have been something like aid during the Balkans War, for aid for intervening in Kosovo or something, and Clinton didn't have anybody on the Republican side he really felt like he could work with. And then, let's see, before that, George H.W. Bush, I think I get my Iraq wars confused. I think it was the first Iraq war. The Democrats were in control of Congress and the Republican was in the White House, and there was the Operation Desert Storm had to be approved by went to Congress to approve that to get the Iraqis out of Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. And if I'm not mistaken, only a handful of Democrats, the Democrats were in control of Congress, but Bush got just enough Democrats to go along with the Republicans to like a one-vote majority to support that intervention. And so it meant that there was nobody like Vandenberg in the Democratic Party that Bush could go to and say, how can we put together a coalition here that'll get the widest possible support? So I think it's more a symbolic legacy, because sadly his other great virtue would be, here we always talk about looking for compromise, his other great virtue would be compromise, and that has gotten increasingly difficult to achieve.
So what would you say we could learn from Vandenberg today, maybe about compromise?
That it is in some ways the highest expression of how a democracy or a republic works, instead of being a dirty word where people can't compromise because they're too principled. I mean, getting far afield, and I have to apologize because I got to excuse myself here in a minute. But people will say, we believe in the principles of the founding fathers, and we're not going to compromise. But if Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson didn't compromise, there would never have been a United States of America. Because one was a northern abolitionist who didn't believe in slavery, and the other was a southern slaveholder, apart from many other philosophical disagreements. We have a Senate with 2 senators from each state, and a Congress that's based on proportions in the population because we compromised between the small states and the large states. Compromise is all the way through the DNA of our country. And yet today it's like, we're not going to compromise. It doesn't work. It can't work like that. Anyway, so I think that would be the lesson for today, to rediscover the need to compromise. And of course the challenge there is with the nature of the electoral system. It used to be that Vandenberg could get away with it because we really liked the idea of having a senator who we might not agree with on everything, but who just was so important in the world. It felt good for Michigan to have somebody who was a big cheese. And we don't regard our senators with that kind of respect anymore, almost. So we want Debbie Stabenow or Gary Peters to vote how we expect them to vote, and they better not compromise, or somebody's going to mount a primary challenge and knock them out, even if the compromise allowed them to theoretically do greater things.
I think that's all our questions.
Yeah.
Good. As you can tell, I'm losing my voice, so it's probably a good thing. Well, great. Well, I hope that helps you.
Thank you so much for
You
your
betcha.
time.
Oh, my pleasure.